In the abyssal dark of the North Atlantic, a legend rests. In 1912, the RMS Titanic plunged into the icy depths, carrying with it the lives of more than 1,500 souls. For over a century, its story has been told in fragments, a mosaic of tragedy, heroism, and myth. But now, the silence of the deep is beginning to speak with unprecedented clarity. In the summer of 2022, a revolutionary digital model of the wreck stunned the world. For the first time, from a crushing depth of nearly 4 kilometers, the vessel was revealed in its entirety. Using advanced deep-sea mapping technology, specialists from the company Magellan, in partnership with the BBC, stitched together a phantasmal reconstruction. The level of detail is haunting. This comprehensive scan charts not only the shattered bow and stern, separated by a vast expanse of seabed, but also the surrounding 3 by 5 mile debris field. This ethereal image is more than a visual journey, it is a forensic tool. Experts can now virtually navigate the wreck, seeking to answer the questions that have haunted historians for generations. How, precisely, did a vessel deemed unsinkable fracture and vanish in such a fleeting, violent moment after its encounter with the iceberg? This digital ghost does more than map a tragedy. It resurrects a world of stark, unbridgeable divides. The Titanic was a microcosm of its era, a floating palace of rigid social strata. A standard first-class passage cost £30 sterling, an equivalent of nearly 4,500 modern American dollars. For the grandest suites, the titans of industry and society paid as much as £870, a sum that would approach $150,000 today. Far below, in the humming belly of the ship, were the third-class passengers. For a ticket costing between £3 and £8, a fraction of the price above, many would scarcely see the sun during the 7-day voyage. While those below dreamed of a world they could not see, that world was indulging in its final, decadent ritual. In the ship's most exclusive restaurant, on its last evening afloat, the menu offered eggs argenteuil, consommé fermier, and chicken à la Maryland. The digital reconstruction brings us closer than ever to the vessel's steel bones. Yet the warmth of that last meal, the final notes of the orchestra, and the human stories sealed within its hull remain beyond the reach of any technology. They exist only in the echo of the abyss, a silent testament to the fragile boundary between gilded ambition and the unforgiving depths. In the grand dining saloons of the Titanic, on the evening of April 14, 1912, the world's elite savored a final testament to the opulence of their age. One menu from that Last Supper, a simple card detailing a feast of oysters, filet mignon, and Waldorf pudding, would survive the night, tucked away in the pocket of a passenger bound for a lifeboat. Decades later, in the year 2012, this fragile paper artifact, a ghost of a forgotten meal, was sold at auction for a staggering $83,000. It serves as a prelude, a quiet moment of luxury before the symphony of chaos began. But beyond the gilded halls of the first class, other, more profound stories were unfolding. Consider a pair of worn leather boots. They offer not a glimpse of wealth, but a silent narrative of sacrifice. These were not the polished shoes of a wealthy industrialist, but standard-issue equipment for a member of the ship's crew. In the final, freezing hours, as the great liner's deck tilted toward the abyss, the anonymous crewman who wore them saw a passenger, ill-equipped for the Arctic chill, facing the evacuation. In an act of profound humanity, he gave his boots away. Eyewitnesses from that night would later recount countless such stories, of crew members distributing warm clothing and their own outerwear, knowing their own chances of survival were diminishing with every passing minute. They were preparing others for a cold vigil in the lifeboats that they themselves would never see. Those boots, now resting in a museum, are more than just leather and thread. They are a symbol of the quiet heroism that shone through the darkest of nights. When divers first reached the wreck in the 1980s, the world held.
This is where things get really interesting. What you're about to hear might explain why this was never meant to be discovered.
Its breath. The headlines promised a glimpse into a submerged tomb, announcing the discovery of physical remains. The public imagination, fueled by decades of dramatic retelling, braced for macabre images of skeletons seated in the deep. But the reality of the abyss was far different, and far more haunting. After more than 70 years under crushing pressure in the acidic depths, the ocean had reclaimed nearly all biological traces. The relentless chemistry of the deep sea had dissolved the bones, erasing the passengers and crew almost completely. What the submersibles found instead was something far more spectral. The true human remains were not skeletons, but ghostly imprints left upon the seabed. A pair of mother's shoes lying next to a tiny pair belonging to a child. A workman's boots resting where a body had once settled into the silt. These were the true memorials, perfectly preserved artifacts of leather and cloth that had outlasted the very people who wore them. They told a silent, devastating story of the ship's final moments, eerie tableaus that looked as if their owners had simply vanished. Alongside these personal effects lay the immense material wealth that had sunk with the ship, a fortune in cash, jewels and bonds belonging to some of the wealthiest people of the era, now scattered across. For years, the ship itself seemed destined to remain an untouchable monument. Yet humanity's drive to reclaim its own history is relentless. The most audacious chapter in the vessel's post-sinking history was the recovery of the Big Piece. First identified in 1994, this colossal fragment of the starboard hull, a 15-ton slab of riveted steel, represented a tangible piece of the fallen giant. An initial attempt to raise it in 1996 failed, the immense weight and unforgiving conditions of the North Atlantic proving too great. But in 1998, in a Herculean feat of engineering, it was finally brought to the surface. It is the largest single artifact ever recovered from the wreck, its sheer size and mass a visceral reminder of the colossal forces that tore the unsinkable ship apart. These relics, a menu, a pair of boots, a massive piece of twisted steel, are more than mere curiosities. They are conduits to a lost world, pulled from the crushing silence of the deep. They force us to look beyond the myth and connect with the tangible human reality of the tragedy. Each object is a whisper from the past, a story of luxury, of sacrifice, and of the awesome, indifferent power of the natural world. The ocean sought to erase this vessel and all its stories, but in these fragments, the voices of the Titanic endure. That glass remains within the portholes of this resurrected hull fragment is nothing short of a miracle. For nearly a century, it withstood the crushing abyssal pressure of the North Atlantic, a silent witness to the ghostly quiet of the ocean floor. Experts who examined this colossal section of the wreck described the ship's original construction as a technical masterpiece, a symphony of steel and rivets. This only deepens the central, haunting question that endures to this day. How could such a marvel of engineering, the pinnacle of its age, founder so completely, so swiftly? Today, this immense artifact, known simply as the Big Piece, rests not in the cold dark, but under the curated lights of a permanent exhibition. In a stark and surreal contrast, its home is the Luxor Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, Nevada. A journey from the bottom of the sea to the heart of the desert. A casino association, recognizing the profound public fascination, underwrote the immense expense of its recovery. They created an exhibition so powerful, so tangible, that it continues to evoke a deep, visceral chill in all who stand before it, connecting them directly to the tragedy of that long-ago night. Yet beyond the cold steel are the indelible echoes of the human spirit. Hollywood has forever seared into our memory the image of the Titanic's musicians playing on as chaos mounted. This was not a fiction crafted for the screen. It was a reality recounted by numerous survivors. The orchestra's leader, Wallace Hartley, and his fellow musicians performed their duty to the very last. They played as the great liner's deck tilted towards its fatal angle, as the lights flickered and died, and as the stern rose impossibly high against the star-filled
This is where things get really interesting. What you're about to hear might explain why this was never meant to be discovered.
sky before its final plunge. Their music was a deliberate act of courage, a final offering of calm intended to quell the rising panic of the passengers. By all accounts, it succeeded. In the face of unimaginable terror, a strange and stoic civility held sway. The final piece they played remains a subject of debate, lost to the conflicting memories of that night. And then there was only silence. Wallace Hartley did not survive the catastrophe, but his violin, in a way, did. Days later, as rescue ships scoured the debris field for survivors and victims, a leather valise was pulled from the frigid water. Inside was the instrument. It had been found strapped to Hartley's body, a silent witness to his final moments. In 2013, this rosewood violin, a relic of profound bravery, was sold at auction for $1,700,000, making it one of the most valuable musical instruments of all time. Weeks later, long after the world's headlines had moved on, the passenger liner RMS Oceanic was steaming across the same stretch of ocean. On the horizon, its crew spotted a lone lifeboat, a spectral sight against the endless expanse of water. It was Collapsible Lifeboat A. Inside, the crew of the Oceanic made a grim and tragic discovery: the bodies of 3 men. Their identities were never definitively confirmed, though it is believed one may have been a senior officer. Final, desperate moments. The story of this boat is one of chaos. It was not launched properly from the ship's roof. In the confusion, many were unaware it even existed as a viable means of escape. When it was finally washed free by the sea, it was already too late for most. That it was found so many miles from the site of the sinking is a testament to the relentless currents of the Atlantic, which had carried this small, makeshift coffin on a lonely, aimless journey. The men within had not drowned. They had succumbed to the slow, creeping death of exposure, frozen by the unforgiving cold. Of the immense multi-million-dollar fortunes aboard the Titanic, the cash, the bonds, the priceless jewels and works of art, only a tiny fraction was ever recovered from the depths. But the recovery of these material things pales in comparison to the true, unrecoverable loss. For every piece of salvaged steel, for every recovered gem, there are 1,000 stories that sank with the souls who lived them. These are the treasures that can never be reclaimed, narratives now kept only by the silent, unforgiving deep. In the silent, crushing dark 2.5 miles beneath the Atlantic, the Titanic became more than a wreck. It became a tomb, gens of sunken treasure, laid plans to harvest its decaying vaults. Yet a solemn consensus emerged among the responsible nations. This was not a prize to be plundered, but a gravesite to be honored. An official decree forbade the exploitation of the vessel. All the jewels, the bonds, the cash locked away in the purser's safe were to remain entombed with the victims they once adorned. This decision found quiet support from the very families who had lost the most in material terms. For the dynasties of the Gilded Age, the human cost had rendered the monetary value obscene. The wreck would be a permanent, silent memorial. And yet, from the abyss, a whisper of that opulence did return. A single, delicate chain of 18-carat gold, recovered from the sprawling debris field, serves today as a tangible witness to the immense wealth that sailed to its doom. For while survival rates notoriously favored the first and second classes, the sea showed no deference to status. The list of the lost was a roll call of industry, finance, and aristocracy. Among them was John Jacob Astor IV, at the time one of the wealthiest men on the planet, returning from a honeymoon with his young, pregnant wife, Madeline. He saw her safely to a lifeboat before stepping back, ensuring,
Stay with me, because what comes next has been hidden for a very long time.
His place in the frozen depths. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, the American industrialist, who faced his final hours with an astonishing dignity. He and his valet famously changed into their evening wear, preparing to meet their end, dressed in our best and courage. And there was Isidor Straus, co-founder of the Macy's department store, and his devoted wife, Ida. She was offered a seat in a lifeboat, but refused, declaring, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the great ship slipped beneath the waves. In the chaos of the sinking, the old maritime edict held sway, women and children first. But love and honor wrote their own exceptions to the rule. But the first harbinger of doom was not a human voice. It was the ring of a bell. The Titanic's bronze crow's nest bell, now an artifact of incalculable historic value, once hung high above the deck. Its sharp, frantic clang was the first alarm, a desperate metallic cry against the immense indifference of the ice. It was rung by the lookout who, moments before, had seen a dark mass loom out of the star-filled night. That sound sent a shockwave of adrenaline through the bridge and drew curious passengers from their staterooms. Seconds later, a deep, muffled shudder ran the length of the hull. Below the waterline, the iceberg had already delivered its mortal wound, slicing open the ship's riveted plates as if they were tin. The man who rang that bell, high in his perch, was Frederick Fleet. It was his eyes that first registered the shape of the infamous iceberg. Fleet would survive the catastrophe, pulled from the freezing water into a lifeboat. But the disaster never left him. The long shadow of that night, the sights, the sounds, the more than 1,500 souls he had watched perish, haunted him for the rest of his days. Decades later, consumed by a deep depression, he took his own life. The bell he rang now travels the world in exhibitions, a silent bronze throat that once shouted the world's most famous warning. Among the few crew members to survive was a stewardess, Mabel Bennett. She reached the relative safety of a lifeboat with nothing but the thin nightgown she was wearing. In the open ocean, with the air temperature hovering near 4 degrees Celsius, she would not have lasted long. But as the lifeboat pulled away, another passenger, a woman from first class, performed an act of profound humanity.
Stay with me, because what comes next has been hidden for.
She removed her own full-length beaver fur coat and wrapped it around the shivering stewardess. In that moment of shared terror, the rigid class structures of the Edwardian world dissolved. There were no longer rich and poor, only the living and the dying. Without that coat, a gift from a stranger, Mabel Bennett would almost certainly have succumbed to the cold during the long, agonizing hours spent waiting for the dawn and the distant lights of the rescue ship Carpathia. These recovered fragments, a gold chain, a bronze bell, a fur coat, are more than mere objects. They are conduits to the past, artifacts that carry the echoes of the final, desperate hours of the unsinkable ship. They remind us that history is not a collection of statistics or technical failures, but a tapestry of individual stories of terror and bravery, of love and loss, of the terrible fragility of life and the enduring strength of the human spirit. On the 10th of April 1912, as the RMS Titanic slipped its moorings in Southampton, a strange quiet hung over its decks. The Leviathan, a floating palace meant to be the pride of the White Star Line, was only half full. One might have expected a frantic scramble for passage, a clamour to be part of this monumental maiden voyage. But the great ship's debut had been shadowed by a crisis that had paralysed the nation, a protracted coal strike. With the arteries of industry clogged, uncertainty was the prevailing mood. Passengers hesitated, unsure which vessels would sail or when. Many simply chose not to risk a ticket. Despite the vacancies, more than 2,200 souls did embark, over 1,300 of them passengers. For a great many, this was a journey of desperation and hope. Crowded into the ship's lower decks, they were dreaming of a new life, a better life, across the vast expanse of the Atlantic in America. But above them, in the gilded world of first class, another kind of passenger walked the promenades. These were the titans of the age, the figures who commanded headlines and shaped economies. In an era before the global celebrity of actors and athletes, true stardom belonged to the magnates of industry and finance. Among them was Isidor Straus, the owner of New York's iconic Macy's department store. There was Benjamin Guggenheim, an heir to one of America's most immense mining fortunes. And there was John Jacob Astor IV, a man of such staggering wealth that when his body was later recovered from the icy waters, he was identified only by a diamond ring and the $4,000 in cash found in his pocket. Yet one name, a name that had been a constant on the passenger list from its very inception, was conspicuously absent. This was not just any passenger. He was, in a sense, the ship's master. J.P. Morgan, the formidable financier and owner of the White Star Line itself, was meant to be on board. For a man of his stature, only the most magnificent accommodations would suffice. He had reserved a personal suite, a sanctuary of opulence, complete with its own private promenade deck and a bathroom fitted with specially designed cigar holders. Morgan, however, cancelled his voyage at the last possible moment. In hindsight, one can hardly fault his decision. After all, who would willingly board a ship that they knew with cold certainty was destined for the bottom of the ocean? Was the sinking of the Titanic not a tragic accident, but a calculated act of mass murder? The official explanation for Morgan's absence was one of simple convenience. He was enjoying the restorative sulphur baths at the French resort of Aix-les-Bains and preferred not to interrupt his leisure for the journey to New York. But an unofficial, far more sinister narrative began to take shape in the disaster's aftermath. According to this version of events, it would not have mattered if Morgan had arrived at the port on time, for the ship waiting at the dock, gleaming with fresh paint, was not the Titanic at all. This theory posits a breathtaking deception. It claims that the vessel which sailed into history was secretly its sister ship, the Olympic, swapped at the 11th hour on the orders of J.P. Morgan himself. The motive was one of cold, corporate arithmetic. Months after its launch, the Olympic had been involved in 2 serious collisions, sustaining damage that was deemed nearly irreparable. The financial ruin of the White Star Line loomed. A damaged ship was a liability. A sunken ship, however, was an insurance claim of colossal proportions. History is written by the victors, and official records tell a story of icebergs and human error. But in the deep, where the truth of that night lies entombed in rust and silence, other stories persist. Whispers of a grand conspiracy, of a calculated exchange of identity that sent hundreds of souls, both rich and poor, to a cold grave, all to protect an empire built on steel and steam. The line between tragic fate and meticulous design becomes blurred, leaving only the haunting question of what really happened in the dark waters of the North Atlantic. In the accepted telling of history, it was a tragedy born of hubris and ice. But in the shadows of this official account, a darker narrative persists, one of audacious deception and cold-blooded intent. It begins not with an accident, but with a secret exchange, a calculated swap designed to orchestrate a catastrophe. The goal was brutally simple: to allow a shipping company to collect a colossal insurance payout on a damaged vessel, disguised as its pristine, celebrated twin. This controversial theory, a persistent whisper against the roar of history, was given its most prominent voice in 1998 with the publication of a book by Robin Gardner. In his work, Gardner presents what he claims is irrefutable visual evidence of the switch. He points to a subtle but critical architectural discrepancy. The Olympic, Titanic's older sister, was constructed with a distinct pattern of 16 portholes along a specific section of its port side. The Titanic, by contrast, was built with only 14. Yet, photographs taken as the doomed liner departed the harbour of Southampton appear to show a miracle of last-minute construction. The two missing portholes are present, seemingly added as if by magic, a final, desperate touch to complete the illusion. But this grand stagecraft of insurance fraud...
Stay with me, because what comes next has been hidden for a very long time, and only a few people know the truth behind it.
Staggering as it may be, is merely the opening act in a far more sinister play. To delve deeper into this labyrinth of intrigue is to encounter a claim of almost unimaginable gravity. The sinking of this counterfeit Titanic, the theory alleges, was not only a crime of greed, it was a meticulously planned conspiracy of murder. We remember the names etched into the legend of the disaster: John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidor Straus. Three titans of industry, men of immense wealth and influence, were all aboard the maiden voyage. None of them would survive it. According to the whispers, this was no coincidence. It is claimed that these three men formed a powerful alliance, a triumvirate united in their opposition to the creation of a United States central bank. Their plan, it was rumored, posed a direct threat to the financial empire of one man, the formidable J.P. Morgan. Feeling his monopoly on the nation's finances slipping from his grasp, Morgan allegedly orchestrated the sinking itself, a monstrous, decisive act to eliminate his most powerful competitors in one fell swoop. It is a chilling accusation, yet one that must be tempered by a crucial detail. Beyond Isidor Straus, neither Guggenheim nor Astor had ever made any public declaration of their intent to challenge the banking establishment. If the ship was sunk deliberately, the question becomes, how? How could such a chillingly precise plan be executed in the vast, unpredictable expanse of the North Atlantic? Did the captain know which specific mountain of ice to strike, and at what precise moment? Was he a willing participant in his own demise, a sacrificial lamb for a secret plot? How many souls aboard that vessel were complicit in a conspiracy of this magnitude? For some, the answer is far more direct and far more sinister. They hold the unshakable conviction that the Titanic never struck an iceberg at all, because no such collision ever took place. Instead, they argue, the liner was brought down from within, a victim of controlled demolition. Proponents of this theory point to the strange and unsettling testimony that emerged in the aftermath. A significant number of survivors recalled hearing a series of loud, percussive booms echoing from deep within the ship's hull as it went down. They described them not as the groaning of stressed metal, but as explosions. But was this truly the sound of detonating charges? Or was it the death cry of a machine tearing itself apart under forces it was never designed to withstand? As the Titanic's stern rose to a near vertical angle against the night sky, colossal pressures were brought to bear upon its structure. The massive boilers, breaking free from their moorings, would have crashed through the watertight bulkheads with unimaginable force. The steel hull itself, groaning under the strain of thousands of tons of water, would have buckled and ripped apart with a sound easily mistaken for an explosion. In the end, these theories endure, clinging to then chaos to see a guiding hand in the workings of fate. For when a tragedy is so immense, the simple explanation of a chance encounter in the dark feels insufficient. We search for patterns, for motives.
Most people stop watching right here. But if you continue, you'll discover something almost no one knows.
For a plot. Because the alternative, that a masterpiece of engineering and 1,500 souls could be erased by a random act of nature, is perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. Within the ship's steel belly, a hellish cacophony erupts. Massive, heavy components, torn from their moorings, crash against the bulkheads, the death rattles of a titan. In sealed compartments, vast pockets of air become compressed bombs. As the crushing pressure of the Atlantic builds, hatches and doors do not simply fail, they detonate, ripped from their very hinges in a series of deep, concussive blasts that echo through the dying vessel. These are the plausible acoustics of a sinking, the physics of a catastrophe. Yet for some, they are sounds that fail to drown out the whispers of doubt. For every accepted fact, a tangled web of conviction spins a different tale, a narrative that stretches far beyond simple negligence or an unfortunate encounter with ice. It is a conspiracy that has not faded with time, but has instead metastasized, sustained by any means necessary. In its modern incarnation, it has claimed 5 more lives. One cannot forget the tragedy of the Titan submersible, which journeyed toward the sunken liner in June of 2023, only to be annihilated during its descent. While the world's consensus points to a catastrophic design flaw, to the hubris of its operator, there are those who whisper of a different explanation. They propose that the submarine was not a victim of physics, but of sabotage, a deliberate act to ensure its passengers could never witness the evidence of a controlled demolition on the sea floor and bring an unimaginable truth to the surface. What is this truth they were allegedly silenced for? What story is truly told by the world's most famous underwater images? The path to the floor of the Atlantic is for most of us only a few clicks away. We can all gaze upon the skeletal remains, but it requires a particular kind of imagination, a specific lens of suspicion, to see in the twisted steel the telltale signs of a meticulously placed explosive charge. Of course, the more alternative perspectives have a ready answer for this skepticism. They argue that we see only what we have been conditioned to see. The official narrative is the veil, the wreckage, the proof, hidden in plain sight. But the search for answers ventures far beyond the realm of human malice and insurance fraud. If ruthless murder and hidden explosives are not yet bewildering enough, the theories descend into the supernatural. Here we must ask, what possible connection could a mummy, or even God himself have to the sinking of the Titanic? To understand, we must turn to one of the souls lost to the icy water, a man named William Stead. The British editor was a figure of contradictions. On one hand, a pioneer of investigative journalism, on the other, a fervent devotee of occult spiritualism. During the voyage, his fellow passengers were captive to his paranormal explanations and ghostly tales. After the disaster, these idiosyncratic beliefs were not buried with him, but were instead cast out into a world desperate for meaning. Several newspapers, including the Washington Post, seized upon the narrative of an ancient Egyptian curse. They printed articles with lurid headlines that screamed from the page, "Ghost of the Titanic, a mummy's revenge." The story claimed that a cursed artifact, an artifact of a vengeful pharaoh, had been brought aboard by the survivor Molly Brown. Some versions of the tale grew even bolder, alleging that an entire sarcophagus, a mummy itself, was in the cargo hold, a claim easily refuted by the fact that the artifact in question has long been, and remains, in the British Museum. Yet beyond curses and phantoms, there was another, more profound accusation. It was born from the boldest claim of the era, that the Titanic was, in a word, unsinkable.
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.
This was not just a boast of engineering, it was a challenge, a declaration that humanity had built a vessel so perfect, so powerful, that even God could not sink it. In the end, the ship lies in two pieces on a dark, silent seabed, a testament to broken promises. And we are left to sift through the wreckage, not of steel, but of stories. Each theory, from the meticulously plotted to the wildly supernatural, serves a deeper human need: to impose order on chaos, to find intention in tragedy, and to believe that a catastrophe of this magnitude could not simply be an accident. It had to mean something. The Titanic is no longer just a ship. It is a canvas upon which we project our deepest fears of conspiracy, our fascination with the unknown, and our eternal struggle with the forces that lie just beyond our control. In the clangor and fire of the Belfast shipyards, amidst the symphony of hammer on steel, a whisper of superstition took root. It was said that certain Catholic workers at Harland and Wolff were struck by a crushing premonition as they toiled on the great liner, a vision that seemed to challenge the very heavens. Gazing upon the ship's yard number, 390904, they saw a chilling message in its reflection. Mirrored in a puddle of rainwater or on a polished plate of steel, the digits contorted into letters, appearing to spell the defiant phrase, "No Pope." Was this a sinister omen? A divine warning against the blasphemy of human ambition? A sign that God's wrath would soon visit this vessel, this monument to mortal pride? It is a powerful, almost biblical tale, and it would be, were it not for one inconvenient truth. The Titanic never bore such a number. In the cold, unyielding archives of history, the records are clear. Her hull number was 401. Her Board of Trade registration was 13142, furting than in the fact. But while some legends dissolve under scrutiny, others emerge from the depths, more poignant than any fiction. Years after the great liner met its end in the abyssal silence of the North Atlantic, a small leather satchel was raised from the debris field. At first, its contents were a mystery, but for the researchers who opened it, a piece of the ship's soul was about to be revealed. Inside, nestled within the salt-stained lining, lay a violin. It was believed to belong to Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster whose name has become synonymous with courage in the face of oblivion. As chaos reigned on the tilting decks, as the final moments ticked away, the musicians of the Titanic made a profound choice. They would not run, they would not scream, they would play. It was their final, defiant act of grace, an attempt to soothe the souls of the men, women, and children consigned to the icy water. As panic began to grip the doomed passengers, these 8 men did everything in their power to bestow a final moment of peace. They offered a serenade to the dying, their melodies a fragile barrier against the encroaching terror. Survivors, haunted by the memory, would later recall the strains of Autumn and the final, heart-rending chords of Nearer, My God, to Thee, playing until the sea consumed them. Wallace Hartley was one of those incredible men, and fixed to the violin found in the wreckage was a small silver plaque, its inscription a testament to a life cut short, a future that would never be. It read, "For Wallace, on the occasion of our engagement, from Maria." The instrument was painstakingly cleaned and restored, and eventually returned to Hartley's former fiancée, Maria Robinson. One cannot fathom the wave of grief and memory that must have washed over.
Most people stop watching right here. But if you continue, you'll discover something almost no one knows.
Her, holding the very instrument that her beloved had played in his final, heroic moments. The violin remained with Maria's family for decades, a sacred heirloom of love and loss. In the early 2000s, it was put up for auction. Its authenticity was confirmed, aided by the little-known fact that Hartley's body had been recovered from the ocean, the leather violin case still strapped to him. By 2013, what was once a simple gift of love had become one of the most sought-after artifacts in the world. At auction, it sold for an astonishing $1.5 million, purchased by a British collector in the first 10 minutes of bidding. To this day, it remains one of the most expensive and emotionally charged pieces of Titanic memorabilia. If the violin speaks to the human cost, another artifact speaks to the ambition that set the tragedy in motion: the ship's original construction plan. Drafted by the Naval Architecture Department of the White Star Line, this sprawling blueprint is the genesis of the legend. Every line, every calculation is a testament to an age of industrial certainty, a physical manifestation of the belief that humanity could conquer the ocean. These objects, a mythical number, a lover's violin, a builder's grand design, are more than mere relics. They are the anchors of a story that refuses to fade. They do not merely tell us of a ship that sank. They remind us of the stories that endure, of the music that played against the encroaching silence, and of the fragile line between human aspiration and the unforgiving laws of nature. In the wake of the catastrophe, a forensic autopsy began, not of a body, but of a legend. The primary evidence? The ship's own blueprints, documents that contained the very soul of the Titanic. Within their intricate lines and precise annotations lay the story of its construction, the specifications of every material, the grand architecture of a vessel designed for eternity. These plans, once a testament to human ingenuity, were now scrutinized as evidence in the greatest maritime disaster the world had ever known. Investigators pored over every detail, searching for the hidden flaw, the single point of failure that could explain the cataclysmic loss. Their mission was not merely to understand the past, but to safeguard the future. They sought to uncover the structural vulnerabilities that sent the world's most advanced ship to the bottom of the Atlantic, ensuring that such a tragedy would never be repeated. The central paradox haunted them. How could a vessel celebrated as unsinkable, a marvel of modern engineering, perish on its maiden voyage? The ship's design was revolutionary. Its primary defense, a series of 15 transverse watertight bulkheads. In theory, these steel walls divided the lower hull into 16 separate compartments. The doors between them could be sealed in an instant, isolating any breach and allowing the ship to remain afloat even with 4 compartments completely flooded. Had the system functioned as intended, the damage from the iceberg should have been a crisis, but a manageable one. The crew should have been able to contain the ingress of water, keeping the lower decks from succumbing to the sea. But the system did not function as intended, because the wound it sustained was beyond the imagination of its creators. The iceberg did not puncture the hull in a single neat hole. It sliced along the starboard side, a long, brutal gash that compromised not 4, but 6 of the forward compartments. The initial assessment by the crew, according to eyewitnesses who spoke with the captain, was tragically optimistic. There was a belief born from a faith in their magnificent machine.
Stay with me, because what comes next has been hidden for a very long time, and only a few people know the truth behind it.
That the pumps could hold back the tide, that the ship could be saved. Their efforts were valiant, but futile. As the icy Atlantic water relentlessly climbed, overwhelming the ship's defenses, the captain summoned the vessel's chief architect, Thomas Andrews. In a moment of chilling clarity, faced with the unstoppable physics of the situation, Andrews delivered his verdict. There was nothing to be done. He predicted, with haunting accuracy, that the great ship would founder in less than 3 hours. For decades, the original blueprints that held these secrets were preserved. Then, in the year 2011, just 1 year shy of the disaster's centenary, they surfaced. These historic documents, the ship's birth certificate and its epitaph, were sold at auction for $38,000. But the ship was not merely a machine of steel and rivets. It was a floating city, populated by stories of hope and despair. Among them was that of Mabel Bennett, a 33-year-old stewardess who had secured what many would consider the job of a lifetime, serving first-class passengers on the grandest liner ever built. For Mabel, that dream nearly cost her everything. One of her most treasured possessions was a long, heavy fur coat, crafted from beaver pelts. She brought it with her on the voyage, a touch of luxury that would, by a twist of fate, become her instrument of survival. When the alert came, tearing through the ship's corridors, Mabel was in her quarters, wearing only a thin nightdress. She was one of the several hundred souls who would escape the sinking vessel. As she was guided to a lifeboat, she grabbed the one thing that could offer protection against the ghostly chill of the North Atlantic night. That fur coat, a simple article of clothing, became her shield, a final, desperate layer of insulation against the encroaching death that claimed so many others around her. The blueprints tell us how a ship was built. The survivors tell us how a world was broken. And in the space between the engineer's precise line and the survivors' harrowing memory, the true, enduring story of the Titanic is found. A cautionary tale written not in ink, but in iron and ice. The cries came first, a cascade of fear that began to fill the gilded corridors as women and children were herded through a frantic exodus.
This is where things get really interesting. What you're about to hear might explain why this was never meant to be discovered.
Amid the chaos, a young stewardess, Mabel Bennett, made a simple, instinctual decision. She reached for her heavy beaver fur coat and pulled it on, a shield against the encroaching chill, before making her way to the boat deck. There, under a sky impossibly vast and studded with cold, indifferent stars, she found a place in one of the few remaining lifeboats. Soon she would be cast adrift upon an ocean of ink-black water, and through the long, harrowing hours of that April night, As the Atlantic's icy breath bit at the survivors, that fur coat would be the one constant, the sole source of profound warmth. It was a fragile barrier between life and the abyss. Imaginable reason she gave was simple yet deeply resonant. It had become too heavy for her to wear. The physical weight was nothing compared to the burden of the history stitched into its lining. Mabel Bennett would live a long and full life, passing away in 1974 at the age of 96. After her death, the coat resurfaced, no longer a personal memento, but a historical artifact destined for the auction block. Yet, bringing such an item to sale is a monumental task. The world of historical memorabilia is rife with forgeries, and to establish provenance requires weeks, sometimes months, of painstaking research. The coat's legitimacy hinged on a single ghostly image. A photograph taken of Mabel after she finally arrived in New York, a survivor stepping onto solid ground. In it, she is wearing the famous fur, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Without that photographic proof, the coat might have been dismissed, its story lost to disbelief. It was certified as the only significant piece of clothing from a Titanic survivor ever to be publicly sold. When the gavel finally fell, it fetched a staggering $210,000. But while a coat can tell a story of physical survival, other relics whisper of the final moments before the end. Over the centuries since the disaster, countless items have appeared at auction. Many are claimed to be authentic, only to be unmasked as elaborate fakes, their sellers facing legal consequences. The stakes for collectors and historians are immense. This was not the case with an astonishing find that emerged in 2017. It was a letter passed down through the family of a first-class passenger named Oscar Holverson. Oscar, a successful American businessman, had penned the letter to his mother on the 13th of April, 1912, just one day before the ship's fatal encounter with the iceberg. His words, written on the Titanic's elegant letterhead, paint a vivid picture of life aboard the grand vessel. He speaks of the sheer scale of the liner, of business meetings with John Jacob Astor, of the vibrant, confident world of the Edwardian elite, all steaming obliviously toward their doom. Even amidst his busy schedule, he found the time to write home, his words filled with affection and the mundane details of his journey. But this letter was never posted. Oscar Holverson did not survive the sinking. His words, however, did. His body was recovered from the sea by the cable ship Mackay Bennett, and there, preserved in his breast pocket, was the letter. His final thoughts, meant for a mailbox in New York, were instead delivered to his mother by the grim hand of fate. What makes this water-stained page so powerful is its profound humanity. It is not a relic of the disaster, but of the life that preceded it. It transforms a statistic, one of more than 1,500 souls lost, back into a person, a son writing to his mother. More than a century has dissolved the years. They are not merely artifacts for sale. They are tangible echoes, allowing us to feel, however faintly, the human pulse of a tragedy that still haunts the deep. The engines, without warning, fell silent. For days, their rhythmic, thundering pulse had been the very heartbeat of the vessel, a promise of progress and power. Now, there was only an unnerving quiet, a profound and sudden stillness that spread across the cold Atlantic. It was into this silence that the dreams of thousands began to fracture. For Ruth Becker, a girl of just 12 years, the journey had been the grandest of adventures. Her mother had purchased tickets for the new marvel of the sea, a floating palace to carry them from a life in India toward
Welcome to my channel. If you're fascinated by hidden truths, lost civilizations, and unsolved mysteries, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe and leave a like so you don't miss what's coming next. Because what you're about to see will change everything.
Reunion with family in the United States. They had already traversed nearly half the globe to stand on the Southampton dock that day, a day Ruth would remember as nearly perfect. The weather was magnificent. The very air hummed with possibility, thick with the scent of fresh paint and new timber. As she explored the colossal ship, a labyrinth of polished wood and gleaming brass, every corner felt untouched, pristine. The crew, resplendent in their uniforms, moved with a crisp efficiency, their faces beaming with pride. The passengers, a cross-section of a hopeful world, were caught in a collective state of wonder, thrilled to be part of such an incredible inaugural voyage. They were all sailing toward the future. Among them was Amafore the Silence. He took pen to paper, writing a letter to his mother. He spoke not of the ship's grandeur, but of a simple human observation. He described watching one of the wealthiest men in the world, John Jacob Astor IV, a titan of industry whose fortune was the stuff of legend. Yet on the decks of the great liner, this mythic figure behaved to person. He sits out on the deck with all the rest of us. It was a small, poignant reflection on a world where, for a fleeting moment, the rigid lines of class seemed to blur against the vast, democratic expanse of the ocean. That letter was sealed in his wallet. When the rescue ships arrived at the site of the wreckage, they began the grim task of collecting what the sea offered up. Amidst the debris and the unforgiving cold, a wallet was recovered. It belonged to Oscar. Miraculously, the letter within had survived the icy depths, its ink a ghostly testament to a life cut short. In time, it was delivered to his mother, a final, precious message from a world that no longer existed. Decades later, these invaluable artifacts, these tangible echoes of lost voices, began to surface in a different arena, the auction house. Oscar's letter, passed down through his family, was eventually sold. It was not merely paper and ink, it was a portal to a specific moment of human connection aboard a doomed vessel. The bidding climbed, finally resting at $145,000. It is known as one of the last letters ever written on the Titanic. Another,
Stay with me, because what comes next has been hidden for a very long time, and only a few people know the truth behind it.
believed to be the very last to leave the ship, fetched a sum of nearly $119,000, and a letter from the valiant bandmaster, Wallace Hartley, sold for approximately $112,000. It is a strange and modern ritual to assign a monetary value to such profound tragedy. With each passing year, the chasm of time widens, and it becomes more challenging to truly connect with the souls aboard that ship. The sheer scale of the loss risks becoming a sterile statistic. But these objects, salvaged from the abyss, refuse to let us forget. They pull us back through the decades, forcing us to stand on that deck, to feel the hope, to see the faces of those who believed they were on the cusp of a new life in America. On the night of the 14th of April, as Ruth Becker, her siblings, and her mother slept in their cabin, they were jolted awake, not by a violent crash, but by the sudden, inexplicable absence of motion. The great heart of the ship had stopped. The adventure was over. Outside their porthole, a silent, monstrous mountain of ice was drifting away into the darkness, having delivered a mortal wound. The dreams of a new world, so vibrant only hours before, were now sinking inexorably into the freezing black water. For most, it is the clamor of disaster that shocks the senses. the deafening roar that announces a world turned upside down. But on this night, for the passengers of the RMS Titanic, the first omen was not a sound, but its sudden and profound absence. For days, the ship had been a living thing, its constant, gentle thrum a mechanical heartbeat promising progress and safety. This low hum was the lullaby of the North Atlantic, a sound so pervasive that its cessation was more jarring than any alarm. In the corridors of the world's most luxurious liner, an unnatural stillness descended. The vibration underfoot was gone. For a moment, there was only a vast, oceanic silence. Then, from that silence, a new sound began to bloom, the murmur of confusion, which soon swelled into the first notes of panic. A young girl named Ruth was among those awakened by the quiet. Her mother, sensing the wrongness of it all, hurried into the passageway, stopping a steward, a figure of calm authority, to ask what was happening. The reply was practiced and placid. Everything was perfectly fine. They should return to their beds. But the illusion was soon torn apart by the jarring clatum. The words were urgent, unequivocal. All passengers were to make their way to the boat deck immediately. The night air was bitingly cold, a stark contrast to the warmth and opulence left behind. The orderly world of the ship had dissolved into a desperate scramble. As the captain's orders echoed across the tilting decks, the grim mantra of the sea took hold. Women and children were to be guided into the lifeboats first. According to Ruth's later testimony, the crisis erupted with such speed that her mother had no time for proper dressing, for the small, ordinary rituals of preparing children for the outdoors. Instead, it was a frantic maternal instinct taking over, fumbling in the dim light, grabbing at anything to shield her children from the elements. The girls, huddled together, were wrapped in a single shared overcoat, a small, inadequate fortress against the unfolding catastrophe. Before the mind could fully process the reality of their situation, they were being pushed, herded into the raw wooden confines of a lifeboat. Ruth would later recall the terror and the chaos, the splintered feeling of being swept along by a current of events too enormous to comprehend. She found herself in lifeboat number 13, a small vessel of shivering survivors cast out onto a black, star-dusted ocean. In the confusion, she was separated from her family. She did not see her mother, her brothers, or her sisters on the terrifying expanse of the Atlantic that night. The reunion would not come until days later aboard the rescue ship Carpathia, when they finally reached the sanctuary of New York. By some miracle, they had all survived, their family unit fractured by the disaster, but ultimately pieced back together on solid ground. Yet survival is not the same as peace. The courage and resilience that carried Ruth through that night could not erase the memory. For decades, the events were a specter she refused to confront, a wound too deep to be exposed to the light of day. Only in her later years did she find the strength to speak, to share her story with a world still captivated by the ship's legend, adding a deeply personal testimony to the historical record. One of duty, discipline, and ultimate sacrifice. An old maritime axiom holds that a vessel is only as good as its crew. On the night of April 14, 1912, this was no mere saying. It was the final defining truth of the Titanic. Among the figures of unwavering professionalism that evening was Second Officer Charles Lightoller. As one of the ship's senior commanders, the immense responsibility of loading the lifeboats on the port side fell to him. With grim determination, he enforced the captain's order of women and children only, an act of rigid discipline that saved many, but also saw some boats launched with empty seats. Lightoller was one of the last to leave the sinking vessel, tasked with launching the final, desperate, collapsible boat. He was an eyewitness to the ship's final moments, a man who stared into the abyss and survived to tell the tale. Though his heart was heavy with the grief of the monumental loss, his recollections were not of chaos among his comrades, but of an almost surreal composure. He remembered a crew that was calm, collected, and resolute, ready to meet its end. They worked in concert, a disciplined ballet against a backdrop of rising water and tilting decks. They moved with a purpose that transcended their own fear, their lives secondary to the hundreds of others they were trying to save. As Lightoller prepared to launch the last collapsible boat, he exchanged final glances with his colleagues. There were no panicked goodbyes, only the solemn, unspoken understanding of men who knew their duty. It was a silent acknowledgement that passed between them. They had shared a great adventure, but Charles knew he was seeing them for the last time. None of them broke. None of them lost their composure. They held their posts until the very end. The story of that night is not one story, but thousands. It is the story of a child's terror and a mother's instinct, and the story of a crew's unwavering resolve. It is a chronicle of human nature under the most extreme pressure imaginable. In the face of the inevitable, some fought for their own lives with every fiber of their being, while others stood their post, surrendering their own future for the sake of a stranger's. It is in this stark, irreconcilable contrast that the true measure of the human spirit is found. Not in the steel that failed, but in the character that held firm, even as the cold, dark waters rose to claim them. He offered no grand farewells, no final sweeping pronouncements. Instead, he shook the hands of the 9 crewmen who remained, one by one, a quiet ritual of shared fate and solemn respect. One of his closest friends met his gaze, a world of understanding passing between them before the launch of the boat. "Goodbye, old man," the friend said, his voice steady against the rising din. "And good luck." The boat, under the command of Second Officer Charles Lightoller, was lowered slowly into the black, impossibly cold water. With methodical calm, he had helped every soul he could into the relative safety of the collapsible craft. Now, from a terrible and growing distance, he watched. He watched as the great liner, a city of lights that had promised a new world, began its slow, agonizing surrender to the sea. But across that frozen expanse, something else carried over the water. A sound that defied the chaos, a sound that should not have been there. In the grand chronicle of courage demonstrated on that night, the ship's orchestra is often an afterthought, a footnote to the tales of officers and engineers. Yet these men would become an enduring symbol of the crew's deepest, most profound devotion. As the liner's forward deck slipped beneath the waves, the 8 musicians gathered around their bandmaster, Wallace Hartley. The order had been given, every man for himself, an instruction to abandon post to seek survival. But the band remained. Hartley, their leader, had instructed them to play on, to offer a fragile dam of melody against a rising tide of panic. They were to be an anchor of calm in a world turned upside down. And so they stood, on a deck that grew steeper with every passing minute, as brave as they had ever been. They played one tune after another, a steady, defiant rhythm, as the lifeboats filled with women and children were lowered into the dark and drifted away. Long after the last boat had departed, as the ship's angle of death became ever more severe, the orchestra played on. Survivors, adrift in the darkness, would later...
Most people stop watching right here. But if you continue, you'll discover something almost no one knows.
recall hearing the faint strains of music carrying across the water. A ghostly serenade, that persisted long after the ship itself was a failing silhouette against the stars. Memory, fractured by trauma, offers conflicting accounts of that final performance. Some swore the last piece they heard was the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Others remembered hearing "Autumn," a waltz that was a personal favorite of Wallace Hartley. The precise truth of the final song is lost to the ocean, but the act itself remains indisputable. The music only ceased when the laws of physics made it impossible to continue. As the Titanic began its final vertical plunge, the sound of tearing metal and the roar of 1,000 tons of machinery breaking loose finally overwhelmed the melody. The musicians, unable to keep their footing, could only put down their instruments and await their fate. On a night that produced countless heroes, none were braver than those who dedicated their last living moments to soothing the souls of others destined for the same cold embrace. Weeks later, as recovery ships scoured the placid, debris-strewn surface of the Atlantic, a small leather valise was found floating in the water. When the crew hauled it from the ocean, they discovered a violin inside. An engraved silver plaque on the tailpiece told its own story, a message from Hartley's fiancée, Maria Robinson. "For Wallace, on the occasion of our engagement." It was, without question, his most treasured possession. Wallace Hartley did not survive that night, but his instrument and the music it represented did. The violin was returned to his grieving fiancée, and it remained with her family for nearly a century, a silent testament to a love and a life cut short.
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.
In the year 2013, it was sold at auction for €1.5 million. Explosions, flashes of light, the groan of tortured metal. These are the sounds of a world ending. But for those who were there, another sound lingered, the sound of music. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the face of ultimate chaos, the most powerful human response is not always to fight or to flee, but to create a small moment of beauty, an act of grace against the encroaching dark. Even from a distance of many miles, for those huddled in the lifeboats, the silhouette of the great ship remained a defiant presence against the star-dusted horizon. It was a city of light, now mortally wounded, refusing to be extinguished. As the liner surrendered to the sea, its death was not silent. Deep within the vessel's steel heart, where the boilers still held immense pressure, the frigid Atlantic waters rushed in. The resulting thermal shock triggered a series of violent explosions, sending flashes of incandescent light ripping through the dying superstructure. For those watching, helpless on the black water, the ship became a ghastly lantern, illuminating the night sky. In that eerie, flickering glow, they could see the impossible, the tiny, desperate figures of passengers still clinging to the decks. The distance was immense, yet the vision was cruelly clear. One survivor would later describe the spectacle with a haunting contradiction. But this was no celebration. Behind the stark beauty of the light was a devastating truth they all knew in their bones. Their loved ones, their friends, their fellow travelers were on that ship, and there was nothing they could do. One can scarcely fathom the torment of the living, forced to bear witness as a vessel filled with hopes, with souls who sought nothing more than a new life in America, met such an appalling end. It was approaching 2 o'clock in the morning when the final, catastrophic disintegration began. By 20 minutes past 2, a complete and terrifying chaos had consumed all who remained on board. Across the water, a sound carried, a sound no mariner had ever heard on such a scale. It was the tortured groan of twisting metal, the deafening shriek of counter-immense, crushing weight of the ocean. Around this time, the forwardmost funnel, weakened by the strain, collapsed. It fell with the force of an artillery shell, crashing into the starboard side of the bridge and tearing a gaping new wound in the ship. This was the tipping point. The liner's angle of descent steepened dramatically, its bow now anchored to the abyss. The stern began to rise, lifting out of the water until it stood almost vertical against the night. Witnesses claimed it ascended 60, perhaps 70 meters into the air, a colossal black tombstone against the stars. For a few eternal seconds, it hung there. And then, in a rush of foam and displaced water, it was gone, swallowed by the Atlantic. The lifeboats, by now a considerable distance from the vortex, were spared the suction and the surge of the final plunge. Those who dared to look back saw one last desperate act. Before the stern vanished completely, they saw the silhouettes of the last passengers leaping from the edge. It was a final, hopeless choice. A leap into the freezing void, a hope for a more humane end than being dragged down into the crushing depths. To call the scene merely tragic is to rob it of its true horror. For hundreds, it was the worst day of their lives. For more than 1,500 others, it was their last. In the immediate aftermath, a book was hastily published, titled simply Titanic. It sought to capture the enormity of the event, compiling every piece of information available in those frantic early days. We now know that many of the initial reports were colored by shock and confusion, some entirely false. Yet, within its pages, the book preserved the raw testimony of eyewitnesses. These accounts, fragmented and agonizing, paint a picture of that evening with a detail that transcends imagination. A mosaic of human suffering pieced together from the ghosts of testimony forever adrift in the cold, dark memory of the sea. From the shipyards of Belfast, a titan of steel and ambition rose. A vessel conceived not merely for transport, but as a statement of an era's confidence. She was the RMS Titanic, a name that would become synonymous with both unprecedented luxury and unimaginable tragedy. Heralded as the most famous passenger liner ever constructed, she was a marvel of engineering, a floating palace designed to conquer the Atlantic. Newspapers and tabloids across the globe chronicled her creation, and crowds gathered from all corners of the country simply to gaze upon her colossal form as she prepared for a maiden voyage that promised to redefine ocean travel. The world was told this ship was among the safest ever built. Her legend was built upon a foundation of supposed invincibility, a narrative amplified by the very architects of her design. But beyond safety, she offered a level of comfort that was, for many, beyond comprehension. The amenities on board were said to rival, and in some cases surpass, those found in the finest establishments on land. This was more than a ship. It was a destination in itself, a microcosm of society, complete with its own rigid hierarchies. The allure was irresistible, fueled by the most potent marketing claim of all, that the Titanic was, for all intents and purposes, unsinkable. For a public long accustomed to the perils of the sea, this false assurance was a siren's call. It seemed the perfect time to cross the vast blue expanse. This illusion of absolute security, however, would soon curdle into one of the most harrowing catastrophes in maritime history. On the night of April 14, 1912, while sailing approximately 300 miles from the coast of Newfoundland, the grand vessel met its fate. In the freezing stillness of the North Atlantic, an ancient monolith of ice delivered a mortal wound. Within a matter of hours, the unsinkable ship broke apart and plunged into the abyss. Of the 2,200 souls on board, 1,514 would perish in the icy darkness. The cost of passage had reflected the ship's stratified world. A ticket in third class, the passage of hope for so many emigrants seeking a new life, cost between $15 and $40. Adjusted for inflation, this equates to roughly $359 today. A fortune for some, but a price many were willing to pay for a chance at the American dream. For the opulent suites of first class, the price was astronomical.
Most people stop watching right here. But if you continue, you'll discover something almost no one knows.
Securing a world of gilded comfort far removed from the crowded decks below. In the final, desperate moments, these distinctions dissolved in the face of the freezing water. As the survivors in the few lifeboats drifted upon the black, placid ocean, they became unwilling witnesses to the horror. Some, it was recorded, turned their heads away, unable to endure the spectacle of the dying. But most could not look away. Blackened by the cold and paralyzed by terror, they watched the scene unfold in a profound, deathly silence. Not a single word was spoken among them. One witness later recounted the terrible calculus of survival. "We saw people," he reported, "trying to get out of the water and into one of the lifeboats that was some distance from us. But the desperate attempts were met with grim necessity. The stewards and officers in charge had to fend them off, knowing that a swarm of panicked souls would have immediately capsized the small boat, dooming everyone." The story of the Titanic is not merely the chronicle of a shipwreck caused by human error. It is a permanent scar on our collective memory, a haunting reminder of technological hubris and the terrifying fragility of life. It remains a monument not to a single mistake, but to the timeless folly of believing ourselves invincible. A story frozen in time, forever whispering from the deep that even the grandest of human designs are ultimately subject to the indifferent and unforgiving forces of nature. The price of a passage was, for its time, a formidable sum, yet it was far less than what many might imagine. For the working man, the dreamer in search of a new world, a ticket in third class represented the wages of 2, perhaps even 3, arduous weeks of labor. It was a life savings gambled on a single transatlantic crossing. But this was merely the entry fee into the floating city. To truly ascend its social strata, one had to climb a ladder built of banknotes. The first significant step was into second class. Here, the cost escalated dramatically. A single berth demanded a minimum of $60, a figure that, when held against the lens of modern inflation, swells to nearly $1,400. This was the domain of the professional class: teachers, clergy, merchants, individuals of respectable means seeking comfort without extravagance. Yet even they were separated by an immense gulf from the world above them. To enter first class was to enter another reality entirely. The most basic ticket began at $150, the equivalent of $3,500 today. This purchased more than just a cabin. It was an admission into an exclusive society, a temporary membership in a club of industrial titans, aristocrats, and inheritors of old-world fortunes. For the ordinary person of that era, such a sum was not merely expensive, it was inconceivable, a luxury beyond the reach of imagination. But even within this rarefied air, there were hierarchies. The standard first-class ticket did not grant access to the pinnacle of the ship's offerings. Above it all, suspended in a realm of almost mythical opulence, was the first-class parlor suite. The price was a staggering $4,350, a figure from 1912, before the great inflations of the coming century. In contemporary terms, this single ticket would command a price well in excess of $100,000. It was a sum spent on a voyage scheduled to last less than a week. In many parts of America, one could purchase a fine family home for less. On the morning of April 10th, 1912, as the great ship stood ready, the air at the Southampton dock was thick with a mixture of coal smoke and palpable human emotion. A vast crowd had gathered, family, friends, and curious onlookers, all drawn to the spectacle of this steel behemoth poised for its maiden journey. They waved from the quayside, a sea of hands and handkerchiefs bidding farewell. For many, it was a final, poignant goodbye. The ship was a vessel of dreams, carrying thousands to a new life in America, a one-way passage from which they would never return. Tears of sorrow mingled with tears of hope. In that moment of departure, no one could have foreseen the true finality of their farewells, that a tragedy of unimaginable scale awaited before the ship would ever see the shores of New York. At the stroke of noon, the lines were cast off. The Titanic, a monument to human ambition, finally slipped its moorings. As the vessel moved, a slow and graceful giant, the sounds of the crowd were gradually replaced by the deep thrum of its engines. On board, passengers watched as the shore receded, as loved ones shrank into indistinguishable figures, as the four colossal funnels began to paint a smudge of smoke against the horizon. Once at sea, the ship's internal geography became starkly apparent. The vessel was a microcosm of the rigid Edwardian class system, and the vast majority of its finest spaces were reserved for the travelers of first class. The very heart of this domain was the grand staircase, a cascading masterpiece of gleaming, polished oak, intricate wrought iron, and a magnificent glass dome that flooded the space with natural light. It was an architectural statement designed to awe and impress. On A deck, a handsome smoking room, panelled in dark mahogany, offered a sanctuary.
Most people stop watching right here. But if you continue, you'll discover something almost no one knows.
For men of influence. A sprawling lounge provided ample space for conversation and society, while two identical veranda cafes served refreshments to those who wished to watch the ocean pass by in sheltered comfort. It was a world unto itself, a perfectly ordered universe of wealth and privilege gliding across the surface of the waves. Every detail was a testament to a belief in progress, in technology, and in a social order that seemed as solid and unsinkable as the ship itself, an illusion of permanence, soon to be utterly dismantled by the cold, indifferent silence of the North Atlantic. Deep within the ship's steel heart, on D-deck, lay a room of breathtaking scale. The first-class dining saloon, the largest single space aboard the floating palace, spanned an astonishing 890 square meters. It was a world unto itself, a gilded cavern of Jacobean-inspired elegance where the titans of industry and society gathered each evening. Yet for those with a palate for more intimate continental fare, a different experience awaited on B-deck. There, an exclusive à la carte restaurant offered the finest French cuisine, its entrance adjacent to the charming Café Parisien, a light-filled veranda meticulously designed to evoke the sensation of a Parisian sidewalk cafe, complete with trellis work and live greenery. Before the grand ritual of dinner commenced, the evening for the first class would often begin in the opulent reception room, a lavish lounge where passengers mingled amidst plush upholstery and ornate woodwork. This was a world engineered for absolute comfort, a self-contained universe of privilege where every need was anticipated. The vessel even boasted a state-of-the-art gymnasium, replete with mechanical horses and rowing machines, and a heated saltwater swimming pool, a marvel of modern engineering. Above, on the open decks, A dedicated squash court offered another diversion for the athletic. When these passengers retired for the night, they returned not merely to cabins, but to sanctuaries of private luxury. The rooms were uncommonly spacious, appointed with the finest amenities, where every conceivable comfort was within arm's reach. The epitome of this opulence was found on B deck, the magnificent parlour suites. Each was a private apartment at sea, featuring a grand sitting room, a full bathroom, 2 separate bedrooms, and expansive wardrobe space. Their most exclusive feature, however, was a private promenade deck, a 15-metre-long secluded walkway offering unparalleled views of the ocean, a privilege reserved for a select few. This was a world gliding silently through the dark, convinced of its own permanence. But outside this bubble of warmth and light, the North Atlantic held its own ancient frozen secrets. For all the conflicting accounts that have surfaced over the decades, one fact remains undisputed. The iceberg that struck the Titanic was a colossal mass of dense, primeval ice. Yet, in the flat, moonless calm of that fatal night, it was a phantom. It remained almost entirely invisible, evading the desperate gaze of the lookouts in the crow's nest until it was far too late. A chilling photograph, capture-action, a vast, jagged mountain of ice, its surface scarred with a smear of red paint, a silent, indifferent witness to the lives it had just claimed. The collision was a whisper that would become a roar, and in the face of this unforeseen reality, the ship's most profound vulnerability was about to be laid bare. Because the Titanic was marketed as practically unsinkable, a triumph of human ingenuity over nature, the provision of lifeboats was treated as a secondary concern, a catastrophic oversight. On board were a mere 20 lifeboats, a number that constituted less than half of what was legally required to evacuate every soul on the ship that night. They were dispatched in a state of panicked confusion, many of them shocking.
And now comes the part no one talks about. But this is where Welcome to my channel. If you're fascinated by hidden truths, lost civilizations, and unsolved mysteries, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe and leave a like so you don't miss what's coming next. Because what you're about to see will change everything.
A cascading masterpiece of gleaming, polished oak, intricate wrought iron, and a magnificent glass dome that flooded the space with natural light. It was an architectural statement designed to awe and impress. On A deck, a handsome smoking room, panelled in dark mahogany, offered a sanctuary for men of influence. A sprawling lounge provided ample space for conversation and society, while 2 identical veranda cafes served refreshments to those who wished to watch the ocean pass by in sheltered comfort. It was a world unto itself, a perfectly ordered universe of wealth and privilege gliding across the surface of the waves. Every detail was a testament to a belief in progress, in technology, and in a social order that seemed as solid and unsinkable as the ship itself, an illusion of permanence, soon to be utterly dismantled by the cold, indifferent silence of the North Atlantic. Deep within the ship's steel heart, on D-deck, lay a room of breathtaking scale. The first-class dining saloon, the largest single space aboard the floating palace, spanned an astonishing 890 square meters. It was a world unto itself, a gilded cavern of Jacobean-inspired elegance where the titans of industry and society gathered each evening. Yet for those with a palate for more intimate continental fare, a different experience awaited on B-deck. There, an exclusive à la carte restaurant offered the finest French cuisine, its entrance adjacent to the charming Café Parisien, a light-filled veranda meticulously designed to evoke the sensation of a Parisian sidewalk café, complete with trellis work and live greenery. Before the grand ritual of dinner commenced, the evening for the first class would often begin in the opulent reception room, a lavish lounge where passengers mingled amidst plush upholstery and ornate woodwork. This was a world engineered for absolute comfort, a self-contained universe of privilege where every need was anticipated. The vessel even boasted a state-of-the-art gymnasium, replete with mechanical horses and rowing machines, and a heated saltwater swimming pool, a marvel of modern engineering. Above, on the open decks, a dedicated squash court offered another diversion for the athletic. When these passengers retired for the night, they returned not merely to cabins, but to sanctuaries of private luxury. The rooms were uncommonly spacious, appointed with the finest amenities, where every conceivable comfort was within arm's reach. The epitome of this opulence was found on B deck, the magnificent parlour suites. Each was a private apartment at sea, featuring a grand sitting room, a full bathroom, 2 separate bedrooms, and expansive wardrobe space. Their most exclusive feature, however, was a private promenade deck, a 15-metre-long secluded walkway offering unparalleled views of the ocean, a privilege reserved for a select few. This was a world gliding silently through the dark, convinced of its own permanence. But outside this bubble of warmth and light, the North Atlantic held its own ancient frozen secrets. For all the conflicting accounts that have surfaced over the decades, one fact remains undisputed. The iceberg that struck the Titanic was a colossal mass of dense, primeval ice. Yet, in the flat, moonless calm of that fatal night, it was a phantom. It remained almost entirely invisible, evading the desperate gaze of the lookouts in the crow's nest until it was far too late. A chilling photograph, capture-action, a vast, jagged mountain of ice, its surface scarred with a smear of red paint, a silent, indifferent witness to the lives it had just claimed. The collision was a whisper that would become a roar, and in the face of this unforeseen reality, the ship's most profound vulnerability was about to be laid bare. Because the Titanic was marketed as practically unsinkable, a triumph of human ingenuity over nature, the provision of lifeboats was treated as a secondary concern, a catastrophic oversight. On board were a mere 20 lifeboats, a number that constituted less than half of what was legally required to evacuate every soul on the ship that night. They were dispatched in a state of panicked confusion, many of them shockingly underfilled. An order misunderstood, a fear of the davits buckling, a failure to grasp the sheer finality of the situation, all contributed to a devastating loss of potential survivors. It is a haunting calculation that at least twice the number of people could have been saved had the crew been properly drilled, had they understood that each boat was built to carry 65 souls. In a moment of supreme failure, one emergency collapsible boat would later be found with just 3 men aboard. Had every one of the 20 boats been filled to capacity, more than 1,300 lives might have been pulled from the icy water. For those who did find a place, the ordeal was far from over. They drifted in a darkness punctuated by the cries of the dying, a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their days. Their salvation would come with the dawn and a ship steaming towards them from the horizon, the RMS Carpathia. Having heard the frantic distress calls, its captain had altered course, pushing his vessel through the treacherous ice field at a dangerous speed. Photographs taken from the Carpathia's deck capture the raw, hollowed-out shock of the survivors. Pulled from the lifeboats, wrapped in blankets, their faces are masks of disbelief, their eyes reflecting a horror that words could never articulate. When the Carpathia finally steamed into New York Harbor on the 18th of April, the docks were a scene of profound emotional conflict. The wild, tearful joy of those reunited with their loved ones was a stark and painful contrast to the vast, silent crowd for whom no one had returned. It was the final, heartbreaking chapter in a story of ambition and disaster, a stark reminder that for all of humanity's grand designs and declarations of invincibility, the final word often belongs to the vast, indifferent forces of the natural world. The cheers that erupted as the RMS Carpathia steamed into port were a sound of profound relief, a desperate release of tension that had gripped a nation. But beneath the cries of joy, a colder, more pervasive feeling spread through the crowd of 30,000 souls gathered under a cold, driving rain. They stood at New York's Pier 54, a sea of anxious faces, each searching for a loved one on the deck of this ghost ship, a vessel carrying the fragments of another, grander world. Tears of reunion mingled with the rain, but they were vastly outnumbered by the tears of a dawning, terrible certainty. For most, the wait was in vain. The hope that had sustained them for days was about to be extinguished. Of the 2,224 passengers and crew who had sailed on the RMS Titanic, a mere 710 had been delivered from the icy Atlantic. An even more chilling statistic would soon emerge, a testament to the brutal calculus of survival in the face of disaster. 80% of the victims were men. The chivalric code of women and children first had been honored, but at a staggering cost, leaving behind a generation of widows and fatherless children. The story of this loss, too vast to comprehend as a whole, began to be told through individual tragedies. A single, haunting photograph captured the world's imagination. Two small boys, brothers, staring into the camera with wide, uncomprehending eyes. They were Michel and Edmond Navratil, aged just 4 and 2. For a time, they were known only as the orphans of the Titanic. Their father, who had taken them aboard under an assumed name, had perished in the sinking. Their mother, back home in France, was living in an agony of silence, completely unaware of her children's fate, or even that they had been on the doomed liner. An entire month would pass before that grainy newspaper photograph would cross the ocean and find her, allowing her to finally reclaim the sons she thought she had lost forever. The news itself traveled with a shocking velocity, carried not by wireless signals, but by the shouts of boys on street corners. A now iconic image shows a young newsboy brandishing a stack of papers with a bold, unbelievable headline. He was part of an army of children who worked the streets in the early 20th century, their livelihood depending on selling the day's events. That day, he was not just selling a story, he was announcing the death of an idea, the myth of the unsinkable ship, a symbol of industrial might and human arrogance, now lying broken at the bottom of the sea. Among those who defied the odds was a 17-year-old named Jack Thayer. He became one of only a handful of people pulled directly from the freezing water to survive. After the great ship vanished, a lone lifeboat, commanded by an officer, made the courageous decision to row back into the darkness towards the fading cries. They found Jack Thayer, clinging with numb hands to the hull of an overturned collapsible boat. He was one of 7 people they pulled from that universe of liquid ice. For 2 of the others, the rescue came too late. Their bodies succumbed to the cold in the bottom of the lifeboat, their journey ending just short of safety. But even the pinnacle of society was not immune. The Titanic was a floating palace filled with the titans of industry and American aristocracy. The wealthiest among them all was John Jacob Astor IV, a man whose fortune, adjusted for inflation, would be valued today at over $1.6 billion. Yet all his power and influence were rendered meaningless against the forces of physics and fate. As the great liner began its final violent descent, one of its colossal funnels broke free, crashing down upon the deck. John Jacob Astor was crushed instantly. The state of his body was such that he could be identified later only by two things: a personalized platinum ring on his finger and the $3,000 in cash he carried in his pocket, a sum that today would approach $100,000, a final, futile reminder of a life of unimaginable privilege. The story, however, does not begin with the survivors. It ends with them. It begins in the quiet hum of a wireless room on the night of April 14th, 1912. At 10:55 in the evening, radio operator Jack Phillips was at his post, straining to interpret weak signals from the station at Cape Race, Newfoundland. He was tired, his ears worn out from the constant static. Suddenly, a message from the nearby steamer, the SS Californian, blasted through his headphones. The signal was so loud, so close, it was deafening. It was a warning. They were stopped, surrounded by ice. Annoyed by the interruption, Phillips sent back a curt reply, "Shut up, I am busy." He never received the full message. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a monument to an age of certainty, an era that believed its technology had conquered the natural world. Its loss was not merely a maritime disaster, it was the shattering of a collective dream. The Titanic was positioned to take shape, a world where progress is fragile, where nature remains sovereign, and where the echoes of a single night in the North Atlantic continue to caution us against the perils of our own hubris. An angry retort crackles through the ether. The wireless operator, his patience worn thin by a backlog of passenger messages, tells the nearby vessel to clear his frequency. He is, he insists, simply trying to maintain contact with the crucial relay station at Cape Race. That curt dismissal, fired off into the North Atlantic night, was directed at the SS Californian. The message he silenced was an urgent ice warning, a warning that might have averted catastrophe. To this day, historians debate the precise role played by senior wireless operator Jack Phillips and his junior colleague Harold Bride in the liner's collision with destiny. They were, without question, members of the ship's company, yet they were not employees of the White Star Line. They served the Marconi Company, and their primary duty was not the ship's navigation, but the transmission of profitable private telegrams for the vessel's affluent passengers. A river of commercial traffic, of stock market updates and personal pleasantries flowed from their fingertips. It is certain that not all ice warnings received that day ever reached the bridge. The officers in command were aware of the danger, having received at least 3 distinct alerts about ice fields in their path. But the information was incomplete, a collection of disparate sightings without a unifying map. In the vast, dark expanse of the ocean, no one knew the exact location of the drifting ice. And so, on the evening of the 14th of April 1912, no one could possibly foresee that the pride of the White Star Line was steaming directly towards its own demise. When the unthinkable happened, the operator's world was inverted. At approximately 15 minutes past midnight, Phillips and Bride received the order to send out signals of distress to any ship within range. For nearly 2 hours, their hands, which had earlier typed out social niceties, now desperately tapped out the call for help. At 2 o'clock in the morning, with the deck tilting beneath them, they were formally released from their duties. In the chaos of the sinking, Harold Bride would find salvation clinging to an overturned collapsible boat. Jack Phillips, the man who had warned the Californian away, would perish in the freezing water. The agent of his death, the iceberg, had struck the Titanic at 23:40 hours, but the fate of the luxurious liner was sealed by a process that began more than 100,000 years ago. Professor Grant Bigg of the University of Sheffield traced the origins of this frozen behemoth back to its very conception. It was born, he concluded, from snow that fell millennia ago in the ancient highlands of southwest Greenland, compressed over eons into glacial ice. Using ocean current data and meteorological records from the era, Bigg's team calculated the prevailing winds and charted the iceberg's long, solitary voyage. One prevailing theory suggests the colossal structure broke free from its parent glacier in 1908 during a period of relatively warm winter temperatures. The year 1912 was in fact an exceptionally dangerous one in the North Atlantic. An unusual confluence of currents had dragged a vast flotilla of ice much further south than normal, prompting numerous warnings both before and after the Titanic went down. At the moment of impact, the iceberg was a formidable presence, measuring an estimated 120 meters in length and rising 30 meters above the waves. Its weight was calculated at around 1.5 million tons. Yet this was merely a remnant of its former glory. During its 4-year journey at sea, it had lost the vast majority of its initial mass. Professor Bigg's calculations suggest that when it first calved, the object was a true monster, 520 meters long, with a staggering weight of 75 million tons. A ghost of the Pleistocene, drifting silently into the modern age. Deep within the iron heart of the vessel, another drama was unfolding. The ship's engineers were the highest paid members of the crew, their expertise.
Most people stop watching right here. But if you continue, you'll discover something almost no one knows. This is where things get really interesting. What you're about to hear might explain why this was never meant to be discovered.
And salvation, clinging to an overturned collapsible boat. Jack Phillips, the man who had warned the Californian away, would perish in the freezing water. The agent of his death, the iceberg, had struck the Titanic at 23:40 hours, but the fate of the luxurious liner was sealed by a process that began more than 100,000 years ago. Professor Grant Bigg of the University of Sheffield traced the origins of this frozen behemoth back to its very conception. It was born, he concluded, from snow that fell millennia ago in the ancient highlands of southwest Greenland, compressed over eons into glacial ice. Using ocean current data and meteorological records from the era, Bigg's team calculated the prevailing winds and charted the iceberg's long, solitary voyage. One prevailing theory suggests the colossal structure broke free from its parent glacier in 1908 during a period of relatively warm winter temperatures. The year 1912 was in fact an exceptionally dangerous one in the North Atlantic. An unusual confluence of currents had dragged a vast flotilla of ice much further south than normal, prompting numerous warnings both before and after the Titanic went down. At the moment of impact, the iceberg was a formidable presence, measuring an estimated 120 meters in length and rising 30 meters above the waves. Its weight was calculated at around 1.5 million tons. Yet this was merely a remnant of its former glory. During its 4-year journey at sea, it had lost the vast majority of its initial mass. Professor Bigg's calculations suggest that when it first calved, the object was a true monster, 520 meters long, with a staggering weight of 75 million tons. A ghost of the Pleistocene, drifting silently into the modern age. Deep within the iron heart of the vessel, another drama was unfolding. The ship's engineers were the highest paid members of the crew, their expertise essential for keeping the engines, generators, and all other mechanical equipment in perfect working order. Their domain was a symphony of steam and steel. Yet, even here, a hidden danger festered. Shortly after the ship departed from Southampton, a fire had broken out in one of the coal bunkers, a slow, smouldering blaze that raged, contained but untamed, for days. The collision, when it came, was therefore not a single isolated event. It was the convergence of countless factors, of human error and commercial pressure, of a freakish season for ice, and of a patient, indifferent monolith of frozen water. The tragedy was not born in a single moment of impact, but forged in a chain of countless decisions and ancient geological forces. A stark reminder that even the greatest monuments to human ingenuity sail upon an ocean of powers far older and far more patient than their own. Deep within the steel heart of the ship, in the cavernous expanse of boiler room number 6, a fire had been smouldering. It was a persistent ghost, a secret known only to the men who toiled in the vessel's sweltering gut. For days, a handful of coal trimmers had waged a silent war against the glowing embers, attempting to quell a blaze that stubbornly refused to die. On the fateful night of the disaster, as the liner sliced through the placid, ink-black water, Senior Engineer John Henry Hesketh and Senior Fireman Frederick Barrett descended into that very boiler room. Their task was to confirm, once and for all, that the phantom fire had been vanquished. But destiny had a far colder adversary in mind. At precisely 11:40, the iceberg tore into that exact section of the hull. In the ensuing chaos, both Hesketh and Barrett miraculously found a path to safety, scrambling through a connecting tunnel as the Atlantic began its violent intrusion. Yet their escape was the exception. The vast majority of the engineering staff remained below, trapped in a labyrinth of machinery and steam. Here, they would wage a desperate, hopeless battle. Their final duty was a doomed vigil to keep the lights burning and the pumps running, a struggle to buy precious minutes for the souls on the decks above. As the great ship tilted, they held their posts, surrounded by the deafening scream of escaping steam and the roar of the incoming sea. In retrospect, their heroic sacrifice is believed to have delayed the final plunge by more than an hour that allowed for the launching of nearly every lifeboat, even if many were cast off, tragically underfilled. In the end, 244 men, engineers, stokers, trimmers, and greasers, went down with the ship, their final moments spent in service to others. Above the waves, the Titanic's silhouette was defined by 4 colossal funnels, each rising nearly 20 meters into the sky, symbols of industrial might. But one of them was an architectural lie. The rearmost funnel, the 4th in the majestic line, was a dummy. While it did serve a practical purpose, providing ventilation for the engine room and the ship's galleys, its primary function was aesthetic. It was a concession to the grand illusions of the era. In the early 1900s, ships with 4 funnels were the epitome of power and prestige. 4 simply made a more profound impression than 3. It was a carefully crafted illusion, designed to project an image of unparalleled strength. But during the sinking, it was one of the functional funnels that would deliver a final, brutal blow. As the ship's angle grew impossibly steep, the forward funnel tore free from its moorings, crashing into the frigid water and crushing a number of people. Struggling before body was later recovered from the sea, identifiable not by his features, but by the fine ring on his finger and the $4,000 found in his pocket. The press, deeply impressed by its design, had christened the Titanic practically unsinkable.
Most people stop watching right here. But if you continue, you'll discover something almost no one knows.
The claim, never officially made by its builders, took on a life of its own. With its advanced system of watertight compartments, it seemed inconceivable that this floating palace could ever be lost to the depths. We now know the folly of such hubris. But if the title of unsinkable could ever be bestowed upon a person, it would belong to Violet Jessop. The story of this British stewardess defies all probability. She was a quiet witness to the fragility of these steel behemoths, surviving not one, but 3 maritime disasters involving the sister ships of the Olympic class. On the 20th of September 1911, she was aboard the RMS Olympic when it collided with the cruiser HMS Hawke. Both vessels were grievously wounded, yet both managed to limp back to port. Less than a year later, she was aboard the Titanic. After the collision, she was ordered into lifeboat number 16. For 8 agonizing hours, she drifted in the darkness before the RMS Carpathia emerged on the horizon. Then, during the First World War, she served again, this time as a nurse aboard the HMHS Britannic. When that ship struck a mine and sank, she once more found herself facing the cold embrace of the sea. The great ship was a monument to human ambition, a vessel built with the belief that nature itself could be conquered by engineering. But the steel proved mortal. It was the human spirit, embodied by those who held their posts in the dark and those who endured the impossible, that proved to be the only thing that could truly be called unsinkable. On the 21st of November 1916, the sister of the Titanic, His Majesty's hospital ship Britannic, met its end, torn asunder by a German naval mine. Among the survivors was a woman for whom disaster at sea was becoming a grim pattern, Violet Jessop. But her escape was far from simple. A lone lifeboat carrying Jessop was inexorably drawn into the death vortex of the ship's still turning propellers. The churning blades, a mechanism of motion transformed into an instrument of annihilation, threatened to pull them under. In the final, desperate moment, she leaped from the doomed craft into the cold Aegean Sea, a conscious choice to embrace the unknown rather than face certain destruction. She would be rescued, pulled from the water by the crew of another boat, a survivor of 2 of the world's most infamous maritime disasters. Yet, even after staring into the abyss twice, she remained steadfastly, almost inexplicably, loyal to a life lived upon the waves. But the ledgers of loss associated with the great liners began long before they ever tasted salt water. We mourn the victims of April 1912, yet the first blood was spilled 2 years prior, not on the frigid North Atlantic, but in the clamour and shadow of the Belfast shipyard. The construction of this floating palace, this monument to human ambition, was itself a fatal enterprise. We often ignore the fact that the dream of the Titanic was built upon the cost of 8 human lives. Of the 8 men who perished, history remembers the names of 5. The first was Samuel Scott, a boy of just 15 years, a catcher's apprentice. One day he slipped from a ladder or a high platform, his life ending with the sickening crack of a fractured skull on the shipyard floor. A similar fate befell John Kelly just 3 months later. William Clark would survive his own fall, but only for 2 days, before pneumonia, invited in by his weakened state, claimed him. During the celebrated launch of the colossal hull, as crowds cheered, James Dobbin was crushed by a massive wooden beam used to secure the ship, a casualty of the very moment of its birth. And Robert Murphy, after a severe fall shattered his skull, succumbed not to the injury itself, but to the over-gend was built. When the ship finally met its destiny, it dragged more than 1,500 souls into the abyss, marking one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of civilian seafaring. Yet a haunting question lingers, one that the passage of more than a century has failed to answer. Of all those lost, only around 340 bodies were ever recovered from the waves. The fate of the remaining 1,060 victims remains a profound and disturbing enigma. One prevailing theory suggests their lifeless forms were pulled down with the ship, accompanying the great vessel on its 2.5-mile descent to the ocean floor. The problem with this hypothesis is stark. In all the decades of exploration, in all the dives to the hallowed wreck site, not a single human remain has ever been found in the surrounding debris field. Another school of thought, championed by some Titanic experts, points to the chaos on the surface. They believe a powerful storm that sweeps a vast expanse of ocean measuring some 80 kilometers wide, delivering them to the depths, far from the wreck itself. Yet another, more chilling hypothesis posits that hundreds of people were never able to escape, trapped deep within the labyrinthine corridors and cabins of the ship as it plunged. Their final resting place would be inside the steel tomb itself. The condition of any such remains today would depend entirely on their location, on their exposure to oxygen-rich currents and the relentless scavengers of the deep.
Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew. Wait, this is not the full story. The most important part is just beginning, and it changes everything we thought we knew.
In all the dives to the hallowed wreck site, not a single human remain has ever been found in the surrounding debris field. Another school of thought, championed by some Titanic experts, points to the chaos on the surface. They believe a powerful storm that sweeps a vast expanse of ocean measuring some 80 kilometers wide, delivering them to the depths, far from the wreck itself. Yet another, more chilling hypothesis posits that hundreds of people were never able to escape, trapped deep within the labyrinthine corridors and cabins of the ship as it plunged. Their final resting place would be inside the steel tomb itself. The condition of any such remains today would depend entirely on their location, on their exposure to oxygen-rich currents and the relentless scavengers of the deep. The renowned oceanographer Robert Ballard, the man who discovered the wreck, has stated that he would not be surprised if, in the deepest, most anaerobic sections of the ship, perfectly preserved human bodies might one day be found, silent occupants of a world without time. This intricate tapestry of human tragedy even extends to the animals on board. In James Cameron's cinematic retelling, a line is spoken with class-fueled disdain. First-class dogs come down here to have a good time. The fiction hints at a forgotten truth. First-class passengers frequently traveled with their canine companions. And, just as the film depicted, these animals were afforded a life of privilege, even at sea, walked daily upon the decks by stewards. There was even a small, informal dog show planned for the 15th of April, a gentle pastime for a future that would never arrive. It is in these details, the forgotten builders, the unrecovered souls, the pets awaiting a show that would never begin, that the true scope of the tragedy is revealed. The sinking of the Titanic was not a single monolithic event. It was a constellation of countless individual stories, of lives lived and futures erased. For every story we tell, 1,000 more lie dormant in the crushing silence of the abyss, waiting for a history that may never be written. Among the heralded passengers of the great liner were 12 souls often forgotten by history, the dogs of the Titanic. As the ship met its fate in the frigid North Atlantic, 9 of them would be lost to the abyss. the three that survived shared a crucial advantage: their diminutive size. These were not the hounds housed in the ship's kennels, but tiny companions kept in first-class staterooms. In the chaos of the evacuation, they were smuggled. Number 6, Elizabeth Rothschild, clutched her Pomeranian, refusing to be separated from it. When the rescue ship Carpathia arrived, the crew initially denied the dog passage, but having just lost her husband to the waves, she would not surrender her last living companion. Yet for Anne Elizabeth Isham, this bond would seal a different destiny. Her dog, a Great Dane, was far too large for a lifeboat. Faced with an impossible choice, to save herself or abandon her friend, she refused to leave. Days later, a recovery vessel made a haunting discovery in the ice field. The body of a woman, frozen in the water, her arms locked in a final embrace around her beloved dog. It remains a silent, chilling testament to a loyalty that refused to yield, even to the primal instinct for survival.